Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser. Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey on October 22, 2012. There were an estimated $30 billion in economic losses to businesses. Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans August 29, 2005. Katrina resulted in more than $25.4 billion in insured losses. May 22, 2011, Joplin, Missouri was struck by an EF5 tornado. Damages amounted to approximately $2.8 billion. The list goes on and on. Our guest today, Dr. Ari Belasen, is an assistant professor of economics at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. His research specializes in describing the economic impact of disasters. He is the author of numerous publications. His findings have been presented at major economic conferences. Today we're going to talk about the cost of storm damage. Dr. Ari Belasen, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you.
So, I think it'd be better at this point if I just let you define what it is that we're going to talk about today. I tried there, but you're the expert here. So tell us what it is that at the end of the day, what people are going to hear.
Sure. So basically, when we talk about storm damage, we talk not just about the financial cost, we also talk about the human cost in terms of the mobility that people have when they are hit with the hurricane or the tornado or the earthquake or you name it.
Tsunamis now.
That's right. So when they have to leave an area, how soon can they come back? What does that mean for the area that they left behind? Are they stuck in that area? What does that mean about the recovery effort in helping them get back to their lives? And again, we've got also that financial cost, which as you pointed out, could be in the $20, $30, $40 billion range in some cases. You pointed out that Katrina had about a $25 billion insured.
That was insured, but in fact, I think it was really closer to $80 billion.
That's right. So, and if you put that in today's dollars, you're talking about $90 to $100 billion, depending on what kind of inflation rate you're looking at. So, we're talking about a lot of money. This is a really large-scale issue that we have to talk about because every couple of years we end up with one of these large disasters that it takes quite a while to recover from.
Okay. So, and I noticed from your writings that there is a difference between more urbanized places that are hit versus more rural places that are hit by these disasters.
Sure.
And also, when we say urbanized, it could still be a third world country. So compared to America or Western Europe, urbanized still is, they're not as modern
That's right.
as what Americans might think of as urbanized.
That's right.
So just describe a little bit about that urban versus rural, Western Europe, Americas versus some of these third world Asian or African countries.
Sure. So when you think about the different populations that are affected, I'll start out with the beginning with the urban versus rural. You have to think about what kind of connections people have, and not just necessarily in terms of who they know or where they are, but really what kind of access they can get. And so when we take a look at an area like New Orleans or New York City that get hit by a large-scale hurricane, we know that those people are typically going to have access to public transportation that's going to get decapitated. Those are the types of people that have a much closer connection to their neighbors because they see their neighbors very often. So we see that the support system has to kind of be a lot more centralized. On the other hand, when we look at a rural area here in the United States like Joplin, we know that they're really much more dependent upon outside sources coming in. So FEMA has to really come in right away to make sure that they can pick those areas up. Looking then at a difference across the two parts of the world, so you've got the developed world and the developing world. When we look at a place like India or Indonesia, where you've got really this mass sprawl of people, so that even when you look in an urban area, you're still looking at people just living in hovels, people living in wealthy mansions, and it's just all kind of mixed together. You find out that it really comes down to a means basis. So if you have the means to get out, you do. If you don't, then you're stuck. And so it really just comes down to a wealth issue.
And when they get out, where are they going?
Well, that's what's
I
interesting.
mean, are they just moving over to the next little town that wasn't hit, or are they moving across the country, across international borders?
Sure. So what we see is that in a developing country, if people have the means to get out, they usually get out and don't come back. So when a big hurricane hit Guatemala, a lot of Guatemalan refugees left for Mexico and didn't come back. And that led to a big refugee issue in Mexico. Similar to what we have with people in the Southwest worried about Mexican refugees coming across the border. It was the same thing in southern Mexico with Guatemalan refugees. So there's this whole pattern of movement. When people can't afford to get out and can't really go that far, you're right, they're probably going to go to the next town over, the one that's not hit. SIU Carbondale was recently hit by an inland hurricane, which is really this scarce thing that never really happens. And so I talked to some of my colleagues down there, and they told me that, well, all our businesses were closed. We didn't really have anywhere to go to, so we'd have to drive out to Paducah to go buy groceries because that was the nearest city that we could get stuff from. So you kind of get this event-specific reaction from people.
So for people who don't know, Carbondale is in way south.
Way south, yes.
Way
the
south
very
Illinois.
Bottom of Illinois.
Yeah, not quite, but nearer to Kentucky than to St. Louis.
That's right. It's about 2 hours southeast of St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. And you're stationed at SIU Edwardsville, which is in the St. Louis area.
That's
correct. Actually within the St. Louis metro area. So what? We're going to stop for just 1 second and just look at some other stuff, like what got you interested in this research?
Okay, this is actually kind of interesting. I was always interested in exogenous shocks, which is a fancy word for things that are out of our control. And so I would look at what kind of an event would occur and how that would affect the economy. So this is something that we couldn't plan for. And I thought that was interesting because looking at how the economy responds to events that we can plan for is a little bit different than these things that just kind of happen out of the blue. As I was doing that, my sister had recently been accepted into Tulane University in New Orleans. Got down there. The day she got down there, Katrina hit. And so she had to go back out. My parents, luckily, were still down there with her. They rented a car. They drove out to North Carolina and then drove straight back up to New York, where they're from. And I said, well, there's an exogenous shock. And sure enough, for the next couple of weeks, we saw gas prices go up. We saw people leaving New Orleans in droves, most of them ending up in Houston, but some of them ending up all over the place. The college students ended up at universities across the country. So here was this massive effect, both economically in terms of New Orleans getting really decapitated, and from a more human migration perspective in the sense that you had all these people leaving.
Americans don't really think of migration.
Sure.
Not like when you're looking at a third world country and,
right.
and you see people migrating from place
to
place.
That's correct.
Americans see it as, well, we're just getting out of the way.
Yeah, but at the same time, we've had big stretches of migration in the U.S.
Very much so.
Right. So when the auto industry really started picking up in the 20th century, we had a large movement of people from the Southeast up towards the Rust Belt. When the car industry started dying, we had people moving back down again to the Southeast. So we do go through these waves of mass migration. And of course, when we had the Louisiana Purchase back in the early part of the 1800s, we had all that westward movement. So we've definitely gone through these historical shifts of migration in the U.S.
Now you talk about exogenous shocks. I
Yes.
picked that right up. That war is actually similar to that. I suspect that you could do more research in places in the Middle East right now. Syria might be an example where there's an ongoing civil war right now.
Sure.
Or Libya that over the last few years eliminated Muammar Gaddafi as the leader.
Right.
Egypt, although I think to a lesser extent there. But
although you never know what's going to happen now. So.
Have you looked at the data that war, as opposed to a hurricane or an earthquake or some other disaster, and are you finding similar patterns?
Well, I've never actually looked at war. There have been countless papers put out in terms of war and peace and the effect on the economy. There's been papers that have looked at terrorist attacks in the economy. I actually recently did a presentation in San Diego on pirate attacks, and so we looked at that
off
kind of
Somalia?
a human, yes, off of Somalia, and so we looked to see, what happened when the pirates would attack oil transports and how that would disrupt oil supply. So that was kind of an exogenous shock from that point of view. It's a little bit different though when you look at human-caused issues, because typically speaking, we know what's going to happen. We've seen it before. We've seen how war decimates local populations. We know who is able to actually benefit from the war in the sense that you get that, industrial development. It hasn't really had the same kind of extent as it had in the 18th and 19th centuries, where you just get the entire country mobilized. The last time we really saw that was the early 20th century with World War I and World War II. Today, when wars happen, especially out here in the Western world, we end up with computers really running the show, drone attacks, and so on. So it would kind of be an interesting study to take a look at, where that deviation was and what kind of a benefit we'd have back then versus what we have today.
Mm-hmm. So, you have, we've talked about hurricanes, but I'm the one who mentioned the tsunamis, but there have been some in, I'm trying to remember what year that was, in and around India and to the sides, where there was a tsunami that I think killed something on the order of 200,000 people.
Killed or displaced, I believe. So yeah, hundreds of thousands of people.
Did you look at that and see?
I did not. The problem is it's very difficult to get data for developing countries, especially for rural areas in developing countries. So when we look at data in economics, we look at both micro data and macro data. Mm-hmm. When you look at developing countries, usually all you can get is the macro data, the big picture. It's hard to really look down and talk to individual people out there and see how they were affected. Meanwhile, when you look at Katrina hitting New Orleans, there were surveys done, there was research done, people went down, they flew down there, they interviewed shopkeepers. I personally went to Ocean City, Maryland after Hurricane Ernesto and did the same type of thing, just on a smaller scale. It's a lot easier when you've got the resources to really pick up that information.
Now asking a question as a real Philistine here. Even though I have done research in the past, what's the purpose of all this research? What is it that the research community hopes to accomplish in writing rather technical papers?
Yeah, well, this is actually kind of interesting because I'm applying for tenure now, so I'm going right through that exact process of why do we do this. There's actually three real reasons why, at least in my opinion, why we do research. One is really to make ourselves known as an individual and as a university. So the state of Illinois wants to see this research come out. Southern Illinois University wants to see this research come out because it brings attention to the school and to the state. Why do we do it as academics? Again, really to push our own name forward, because we want to make sure that people look and see what we did. People remember what we did. It's kind of our way of making an imprint. Why do we personally do it in terms of the audience that we look at? It's really an education standpoint. As an educator, we look to not only educate our students, but also to kind of educate people around. So when we write our papers, granted they're very technical a lot of times, and they're kind of hard to follow, but we still have to keep in mind that we have to approach them with somewhat of a standpoint that a layman might want to read it at some point in time. Mm-hmm. A lot of my research is focused on policy as well. So we've done some policy recommendations for the city of New Orleans, for the state of Florida, for the New York metro area. I was able to give a talk in New Orleans about a year after Katrina to talk about what we've seen in the recovery and what we can expect going forward. So there's that point of view as well, and that's really that third branch.
Yeah, I was going to say, this can't all be hubris that you're just trying to.
Right.
Like, hey,
yeah,
I wrote this paper, and look at SIUE. We're look at how hot we are. So there is actual use for the work that you do.
Yeah, and
as opposed to just
for the
creation
school, it's
of
about
words.
Getting that grant money. So that's why they need to get the name out there. So it's really about getting those dollars in.
But I mean, in the real world.
In the real world, it's the policy side. So yes.
Right. And do you feel that your work or work that you're associated with has had real world impact?
I think so. I'm right now putting together a paper with a colleague at Carbondale on the tax implications of hurricanes. So we're looking to see what happens to tax dollars, and in turn, what happens to local services. So if people leave, they're not buying goods and services in that area, what's going to happen to the local government that's no longer collecting sales tax dollars? And so we can kind of look at it from that point of view and then make recommendations to local emergency officials or FEMA as to how soon or how much to really put into the regional economy.
I suspect that people really don't think in those terms, that like in Joplin, shopping stopped for a while. And
That's right.
a lot of people get paid through sales tax money.
That's correct.
And
then what happens is the state then has to come down and give aid to the city, and if the state doesn't have the money, then they have to go talk to the federal government and ask for a grant from FEMA. And so there's just this pattern of localities. I mean, if we look at Detroit right now declaring bankruptcy, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to see the federal government probably have to step in to bail them out because Michigan can't do it. So you've got this micro impact of this storm, or in Detroit's case, this bankruptcy hitting, and then you've got this kind of far-reaching effect that impacts taxpayers all around the country.
I suspect that Detroit's going to find itself standing on its own.
You think so?
Oh yes. I think that if the federal government even puts one toe in that water, that they will suddenly find dozens at first, and then hundreds, and then perhaps thousands of municipalities, including the state of Illinois,
it could be,
by the way, which is, from what I hear, is on the ragged edge itself.
But if you think about it, that's from maybe a direct point of view, but if you take a look at the indirect point of view, if you've got thousands of people on pension where their pension dollars have just dried up, well, the government's going to have to come in through some sort of welfare type program to actually provide some sort of assistance to them, whether it's food stamps, increased SSI, programs like that, where you're just putting these indirect dollars back into the area. There is going to be some government relief, even if it's not a direct check that Washington's writing to Detroit.
I wonder what happens when all of a sudden the American government, with all of its debt, suddenly finds it doesn't have real money to put into these programs like you're talking about, other than money that can just be printed, and the outcome of just printing money.
I have no idea what would happen from that point of view. To be honest, I don't really see that as that big of an issue. As soon as we have more economic growth, we'll have more taxpayers paying in federal dollars, and I think that this blip that we've got going on right now can be averted. It might take a while, but I'm not so worried about a budget deficit right now. We've brought it down. It would be nice to bring it down to zero, but that's something that's really not an issue that's kind of affecting us on a day-to-day basis.
Growth does solve a lot of problems,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So have you followed up in New Orleans? I mean, yes, there was this exogenous shock to New Orleans called Katrina, but it's been many years since then, and I imagine that there has been considerable wealth created since that time.
There has been. Their public transportation is probably better than it was before Katrina, because a lot of it had to be rebuilt. They've had a lot of issues in the sense that in poor areas, in prisons, they've had a lot of destruction that's still being cleaned up today. Angola's prison flooded out completely. They had dead prisoners that they had to kind of take care of and figure out what to do before they could reopen it. Regions got flooded out completely, especially down in the basins. It was a shame. It really was. And they really had no idea. And of course, there was all this blame put back and forth, which was just really a waste of time and effort, when they really should have just been in there, digging it up and fixing up people's homes. Today, I think the best thing to do for New Orleans would be to kind of forget about some of those areas that are still not rebuilt and try to build on the outsides. Maybe move New Orleans inland a little bit so that you don't have so many people living in those impoverished areas. And unfortunately, someone that owns a home out there, it's really hard to tell them, okay, walk away from all of your stuff. So it's really just a matter of maybe, putting forth some sort of incentives to get people to start buying outside.
Well, after the 93 flood in the Mississippi, Missouri rivers, the Merrimack, in the St. Louis area, there finally was some decision by governments to buy up certain floodplain areas and tell people, hey, can't be there anymore.
That's right. And then you force people to either move further out west or further in east. And so, that's the type of thing that New Orleans really should be doing. I'm not quite sure if that's what they're going to do, but as you said, this is a number of years later, and
we're like 8 years later.
That's right. That's right.
You would think that in 8 years that.
Well, the population still hasn't recovered fully. If you look at the last census, Louisiana lost a delegate, so they don't have as many electoral votes as they had before.
I was just going to get into your studies on the outflow migration and the impact. So go ahead, talk about that. You just mentioned that as a result they have one less member of the Electoral College.
Right, so that's a little bit less influence if you think about it. Then again, if you take a look at the crime rates in New Orleans, they've gone down. However, the crime rates in Houston have gone up.
Because the criminals move there.
That's right. So a lot of the elements that undesirable elements said, okay, well, if we can't do anything out here, we're going to go find a new city to kind of try to run the show, so to speak.
I thought it was interesting your comments of Houston versus Dallas also.
Right.
Why don't you describe what your thinking was there?
Well, I mean, what we did in that particular study that I sent you was we took a look at this kind of global picture of all of these different studies that were taking place on hurricanes and other disasters. There was a technique that was developed a few decades ago called a meta-analysis, and what you do with that is you take a look at everyone's research and you kind of compile it to really get a good aggregate view of what in our case a disaster does to a group of people. So there was a specific paper that looked at migration from New Orleans out to Houston. And that paper took a look at the differences between people moving into Dallas, people moving into Houston, and really where those people are coming from. And so we can see what happened with Dallas simply getting larger, wealth was being created, whereas in Houston, you had everyone kind of flowing into the inside. So there wasn't really this much sprawl due to these new migrants, but rather you had a lot of growth and urbanization, crime rates went up, wages really didn't end up picking up. The city didn't really do any better than it did before those migrants came in. And again, when we're talking about migrants, we're talking about Americans moving from one state over.
I was just going to say, it might be an interesting study on your part to take a look at Houston 73 to 85. You mentioned the Rust Belt earlier in this discussion, but I can remember when people were leaving
the oil boom.
Michigan, Ohio, I mean, because basically after the Vietnam War, there was a tremendous decline in the what was the old Northwest Territory, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and there was tremendous numbers of people who said, I can't get a job here. So
That's right.
Like you said, they went, they went to South Carolina, North Carolina, but a lot of them went to Houston. I remember Houston had this enormous increase in population to the point where their highway system could barely handle. That would be an interesting study.
That's right. Now they've got the huge belt that goes around the whole city. I mean, they've definitely done a good job on the outsides, but again, the inside, you end up still with areas, with pockets where there's just a really high level of poverty, and of course, lack of resources, lack of police, high crime, and so on. It would be interesting to see if, I know the climate's a lot worse, but if we get that same type of effect in North Dakota with the recent oil discoveries up there, if we see a lot of people starting to move up there. I mean, they definitely have the lowest.
Like 2% unemployment.
That's right.
Of course, there weren't that many people there to begin with.
That's right.
But there have been quite a bit of movement.
But there's been more six-figure jobs created up there than anywhere else in the country. So it's interesting.
It's oil.
Yes, exactly.
So we got about 5 minutes left here, and at this point, I usually say to the guest, if there's anything that you wanted to discuss that we haven't so far, jump in.
Sure. If you take a look at some of the other research that I've done, just to kind of highlight some other things that I've looked at, what you'll find is that a common thread that you see in economic development, be it here in the Western world or over there in the developing world, is that people really are the driver. So when your people start moving out and you start losing your resource, your human resources, you definitely see this stalling effect. And you brought up the idea that in the Middle East, we might see some sort of economic impact due to all the turmoil. Well, the same thing was true thousands of years ago. One of the things that I studied was the historical impacts of disasters.
Even in only hundreds of years ago, when in Spain, Jews were tossed out.
That's right.
And suddenly there was an enormous impact. I believe that they went to the Turkish Empire.
Yes, yes.
Wound up, or the Ottoman Empire
that's actually,
at that time.
my family was actually a part of that.
Yeah, and so that was a migration that
that's
occurred.
Right, that's right. I mean, so you can look back, and we've got this documented going all the way back to, you know, the Greek and Roman times, and so you can see what happens with mass movements of people. And it's really taken us until about the 20th century before we really understood that moving large groups of people will have far-reaching implications. And
especially when you move the best and smartest ones.
Definitely, yes.
Like Adolf Hitler's Germany.
You're right.
Where a large number of people left, the brightest souls
left
from there.
We were honestly lucky that a lot of the German Jewish scientists ended up coming here to the United States. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. They might have had the nuclear weapons before we did.
But we benefited in
that's
that.
Right.
We,
that's
the,
right.
we, the West,
yes,
and the United States in particular, benefited greatly from immigration.
Sure, that's right. That's right.
You know, immigration gets a bad name in this day and age, but
because people usually think about this small percentage of illegal immigration and don't really look at the big picture.
And they think of the poor immigrating, coming in and demanding to take, as opposed to people who come in who have lots to offer.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of people do come here for a degree. They'd like to stick around. My family came as my father was working on his Ph.D. We ended up staying here. I believe we've contributed positively to the economy. But you know, you can see this thing that happens over and over again. And what I was trying to point out was that my research on hurricanes, my research on migration, it's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we're looking at such a small thing when I and my colleagues do the research that we do. Even the best models that we can come up with still don't explain the whole picture. To kind of look at, well, what's really going on and what's going on outside of our, you know, isolated exogenous world, this thing that we have no control over, because what we do have control over, what we call endogenous, that's a much bigger piece of the pie.
Humans are basically irrational. And that's,
as economists, we hope not. We hope not.
And that's why before what I said to you was, you know, the math models.
Yes.
You know, that deals with when you're dealing with science. You know, if you're, you know, math applies there when you're looking at the stars and the movement of the stars. You can calculate exactly.
Sure.
But the movement of people, you can only guess.
Yeah, oh, exactly. Well, and that's why we have such issues when government policies happen, because they can only assume what they think will happen when they do something, but chances are that something else will also happen at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And have you taken a look at those people who like stayed in New Orleans and their reasoning and what you know, why they didn't go?
Sure. A lot of people stuck around because they thought, well, this would be a great opportunity for me to rebuild, a great opportunity for me to get a foothold before everyone starts coming back in. And
did it work out for them?
It did work out. I mean, a lot of local businesses, restaurants, and stores were offering much larger wage incentives than ever. There was a McDonald's that was offering a $50 per week bonus. Now, $50 per week doesn't sound like all that much money, but if you're making $6 or $7 an hour, that's equivalent to an extra day's work. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty good bonus that they were offering their workers to get them to stay. So for some people, they stayed for economic reasons, just like how some people left for economic reasons.
I wish we had more time. I
know.
really do, because you know we're
we're
just getting into it. So thank you very much for being with us today. I certainly appreciate it. And to the audience, I've been speaking with Dr. Ari Belasen. He's an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, which is in the St. Louis region. We've had I wasn't sure about this conversation because it could have got pretty technical, but we tried to keep it where you could understand. Oh, do tell your friends that this has been uploaded to YouTube, and go take a look and show it to them. Thank you.